Of the 200 witnesses that were interviewed, only 2 of them positively identified Martin Bryant as the person who shot at them or who was at Port Arthur. Everyone else saw a person with a long coat and long blonde hair. There are people that did know Martin Bryant, known him from an early age, people like Jim Laycock, Wendy Skua, and their witness statements and their testimony contradict the story that Martin was the identified shooter. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. During my investigations into Port Arthur over the 8 years, I've spoken to many of the people that were directly involved with the tragedy. So a lot of my research wasn't just what I read online and what was espoused with various publications and books. I wanted to speak firsthand to the people who were there, who had some involvement, and get their perspective, give them the opportunity, in essence, to tell their story. One of these individuals was a man by the name of Michael Rick Dyson, Rick being a nickname. Over the course of my dealings with Michael, he initially was fairly hostile because Michael was accused of being one of the additional shooters at Seascape Cottage. There were reports there were multiple shooters, and a recording does exist where Martin, who was talking to police negotiator Terry McCarthy, was having a fairly amiable conversation about making a cup of tea and sandwiches for the hostages, and in the background clearly were gunshots being heard, being fired by presumably somebody else. The police tried to explain this away as being coughs, but they were independently verified as being gunshots. So the theories arose that there were more than one shooter at the Seascape Cottage, which was the siege at Port Arthur. There were reports from some of the police that they believed that there were multiple shooters at the cottage at the time. So I spoke at length with Michael. Michael at the time was a Special Operations Group police operative, and he was also involved in many ways with some of the SACPAV exercises that had taken place on the Tasman Peninsula in the months before Port Arthur. SACPAV stands for the Standing Acting Committee on the Prevention Against Violence, which in essence was a whole series of exercises implemented by the police, including tactical police, and a limited involvement from the military, principally with things like transport, communications, logistics. It's a law in our country that our own military can never be deployed in any aggressive military capacity against Australian citizens on Australian soil. So any involvement by organisations such as the Special Air Service, the S.A.S, and the ADF, Australian Defence Force, would be in support capacity only. SACPAV exercises were carried out, and Michael Dyson was involved. He was also guarding the house that Martin lived in Newtown, and basically reported that while he was distracted talking to a reporter, someone had managed to gain access to that house and illegally steal a photograph of Martin Bryant, which then ended up on the front page of most of the newspapers, including the Mercury, with the, preemptive headlines of "This is the man" and "The face of a killer." At the time, Martin Bryant hadn't even been charged. So the newspapers were slapped across the wrist for basically potentially prejudicing a trial by determining that Martin Bryant was guilty and he hadn't even been charged. So Michael had copped a lot of online abuse and accusations that he was Rick. As stated before, his middle name, he was Michael Rick Dyson, and that on the phone with Terry McCarthy, Martin Bryant, who was taking the pseudonym Jamie, said that Rick was in the cottage with him, that he knew Rick well, that he knew Rick's wife, and that he had shot with Rick regularly. Some of the police officers that were attending during the siege were asking questions about who Rick was, and they were told, oh, that's the hostage. And, any inquiries as to who that might have been was sort of shut down, so to speak. So Michael had copped a lot of accusations and abuse and basically defended himself, said he was not in any way involved in the shooting at Seascape Cottage. And I remember asking him at the time, that some of those accusations that he was a killer, that he was one of the shooters, basically could be defined as slander or libel. And I asked him, why didn't you take these people to court if they've slandered you? And he said, well, I did, but the problem is that most of them didn't have any money to be able to, get recompense from. So he was, in his own words, he's fairly angry and adamant that he was in no way at all involved with Port Arthur. I have cautioned people that it's all very well to label accusations, but without hard evidence and proof, you run the risk of basically opening yourself up to litigation. As a result of what he went through, Michael has written a number of books on, in essence, cyberbullying. And I've spoken to him at great length. He's been a serving police officer for many, many decades and now resides in a foreign nation and undertakes sort of consulting police activity, if you like. But he was one of the people that were accused of being in the Seascape Cottage under the name Rick. A slight other coincidence, there was mention that the professional shooter, if you like, or the shooters that were involved in the false flag operation that Port Arthur is accused of being, were Special Air Service soldiers, highly trained individuals who are very proficient with firearms, and that these may have been utilised to basically undertake the main aspect of the shooting at the Port Arthur tourist colony, and then to also assist Martin Bryant in his siege at the Seascape Cottage, where later on he was arrested. There was reports that those particular Special Air Service soldiers, if they were the ones that had been utilised to undertake that attack, and of course that has never been proven, were killed in the helicopter crash, the Blackhawk helicopter crash that took place shortly after 1996 in Townsville in Queensland, in which I believe 19 Special Air Service soldiers were killed. Coincidentally, one of those soldiers was signalman Henrik Rick Peters. Rick, once again, being a nickname. Look, once again, it's a coincidence that there are two Ricks that may or may not have been associated, and there was mention of Rick at Seascape Cottage. But I say again that, a lot of this stuff has to be proven, and that's why we need an inquest and an open trial. Reports of other shooters at the cottage also correlate with some other unusual events that were witnessed and put in statements by police. The two attending police at Seascape Cottage, the first ones on the scene, which was Gary Whittle, and Paul Hyland, both tendered witness statements saying that they saw a naked, screaming woman, dark-haired woman, running between the buildings at Seascape. Now, that's a very unusual thing to witness. The only female that would have been present at Seascape, if you can believe the main story, would have been Nolene Martin, or Sally Martin as she was known, who was an elderly woman with grey hair. She and her husband were killed, and their bodies were recovered in the ashes of Seascape. But it's never been determined who the naked screaming woman was running between the building. even though that is available on witness statements. The other interesting thing about information that's contradictory in regards to the Seascape Cottage siege is that witnesses that were driving vehicles past Seascape, either to or from Port Arthur, and were fired upon, had some different witness statements about who shot at them. There was a witness statement where they described someone with reddish short hair and a beard, wearing a flannelette shirt, firing from the entranceway to the Seascape Cottage. So once again, there is some discrepancies with the witness statements about the identity of the shooter. Martin, of course, was arrested at Seascape, so it places him there at one of the scenes where there were firearms discharged, firearms located. The Seascape Cottage was set alight. Bryant was accused of setting alight to the cottage, but there are reports that another Special Operations Group officer, Andrew Fogarty, had fired incendiary devices that had incinerated both the BMW that had been taken by the shooter and the cottage itself. He later admitted that he had fired 2 illuminating flares. So there is some question as to how the Seascape Cottage was set on fire, which then basically led to Martin Bryant running out of the building on fire, where he stripped off his clothes, he was naked, and then he was arrested by arresting Special Operations Group police. So yes, Martin was present at Seascape Cottage, but in terms of connecting him directly to the Port Arthur shooting site, that, in my opinion, has not been determined 100% beyond reasonable doubt. Of the 200 witnesses that were interviewed, only 2 of them positively identified Martin Bryant as the person who shot at them or who was at Port Arthur. Everyone else who, of course, didn't know Martin Bryant basically saw a person with a long coat and long blonde hair. So unless they personally knew him, then there is some question as to whether or not the person they saw was Martin Bryant. There, of course, conversely to that, there are people that did know Martin Bryant and had known him from an early age, people like Jim Laycock, Wendy Skua, and their witness statements and their testimony basically contradict the story that Martin was the identified shooter at Seascape Cottage. John Godfrey was another witness. He was an ex-Vietnam veteran, and his witness statement was that the person that he saw, in his opinion, was not the person in the paper that the Mercury had printed a photograph of, which was Martin Bryant. Graham Collier, of course, was a person who was first-hand within spitting distance of the shooter, who watched him walk in, do a traverse of the cafeteria and come back in shooting. He turned to protect his loved ones. As he turned back, he took a bullet in the throat. He's a remarkable man who managed to survive that injury. And he basically stated in his witness statement that the person he saw enter the cafe had a pock-marked face and, quote, workers' hands. He spoke to me and said that he had a sort of a military bearing, but he was noticeable because he had this long flowing blonde hair and was acting quite suspiciously. Later on, when Graham was in hospital, police brought in an identikit board with photographs of various people, some with blonde hair, some with not, and asked him to identify the person who shot him. He said, he told me, quote, you could have put a blonde wig on Big Bird, the photos were that fuzzy. So he was very unsure, said, look, well, this photograph, this person has blonde hair. And they said, okay, you've identified Martin Bryant. And he said, no, I won't agree to that. But Martin Bryant was being kept in the floor above Graham. So he said, why don't you take me up there and I'll have a look at him and I'll identify him. And they said, no, you don't need to do that. So once again, for all the people out there that say everyone saw that it was Martin Bryant, they saw a person in a long coat with blonde hair. And there are witness statements, first-hand eyewitness statements in close proximity that basically say that that person was not Martin Bryant. Once again, what would definitively prove the guilt or innocence of Martin Bryant would be a release of the DNA on the food trays that were inside the cafe, the ballistics, the discarded shell casings, the discarded firearm magazine, DNA, fingerprints. All of that would 100% determine the guilt or innocence of the party involved. Unfortunately, we have to wait till 2091 before there's ever a chance that that information will be released. So to summarise, were there additional shooters at Seascape Cottage, multiple shooters? The indications are that that was the case, and that Martin was either lured or tricked to attend there and to take part in a form of exercise, but that basically he was set up to take the greater fall as an obvious and almost justifiable patsy for the much larger event that took place down at the Port Arthur tourist site. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. Feel free to share far and wide and see the attached files in support of the episode. Thank you.